Lindsay said she might be late.
Yeah. I will start by saying thank you all for being here before I officially call us to order at 3 on the dot. We'll start on time. But thank you for bearing with me. I'm a creature of habit, so I swapped us back to the direction we used to be because I can't help it. I'm the person who always sits in the same seat, even if you don't assign it. So that's who I am as a human, so thank you for understanding my switch. I do have to leave early. Most of you know that I am officially back in the work travel swing after a 2-year stint, so I didn't calculate this into my work schedule, so my apologies. Vice Chair Haggerty is the vice chair of this committee as well, and so when I have to dart out to the airport, he will continue the meeting and close us out. So I think I've given you all of my disclaimers, and it's officially 3 o'clock, and we will officially call our first policy meeting of 2023 to order.
I'll try not to wreck it too bad.
I got this. You got this. Hopefully you all are in assembly. And as always, for our new board members, your committees are just like our board meetings. Everything will be uploaded into assembly, and it's here for you today. And so we will start with our minutes from our November 29th meeting, which I already have a change.
So this is minor, but I noticed if you look at the minutes, it says approved minutes for October 27th, 2022, and then it says the October 25th, 2022 minutes were approved. So I know that's just a typo, but
So it does need to be.
and I don't know which day is correct, the 27th or the 25th. Anybody?
The last one.
Yeah, I could probably look it up. We do need that to be an amendment so that we can correct the minutes. So the last one was probably the 25th. So you'll note that for our minutes. We have a motion to amend our policy minutes from the November meeting. It's actually October 25th is the correct date of the last policy meeting. I'll entertain a second. Mr. Swanson. Also for minutes, you're going to, sorry, I moved up here so they could also hear, but for minutes, they'll have to capture that. So you will use your teacher voice. Thank you. We have a motion and a second. All in favor, please vote by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, same sign. Hearing none. The minutes have been approved. You all received an email from me, and by now you've met, certainly you've met Dr. Robinson, but hopefully you've also met Dr. Crane, who has been the mastermind behind this migration for I don't even know how many years. But thank you, Dr. Crane and Dr. Robinson, for agreeing to my process of wanting to, all the committees I chair, to actually start from a 101 perspective so that people understand when we use language like policy migration or it's the School Boards Association policy, that there is some backdrop as to why we are doing this. And so thank you for agreeing to put together a overview, and I will turn it over to the two of you.
Thank you. Committee Chair Johnson Osler, Superintendent Moore, and members of the board. As you shared, we are here this afternoon to present the Policy Committee Policy Migration Overview. During this presentation, you will receive information about where and how to access school board policies. You will also receive information that clearly outlines policy formation, regulations and procedures. And lastly, you receive an update about our policy migration project. So at the end of the presentation, we have blocked out time for clarifying questions and/or any comments you may want to share. So at this time, I turn it over to Dr. Crane, and she will take you through the presentation. Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon, everyone. So it was my job to put together kind of an overview of the policy committee and the work that we do, the kind of functions that we operate, the sort of the protocols that we operate within, the parameters of the committee and how we all function together, so that when we present our first two policies later today, you're really up to speed on all that. So if you don't know where our policy manuals live on, our policies live online, they're pretty easy to get to. You click on About Us, you have this wonderful little face that pops out at you, and you click over on the school board. And then you get these 4 pink boxes at the bottom of that. And you'll click on View Policies, and that will take you to our policy manual landing page. We have 2 things that are listed there, our policies and our R&P. Policies really do belong to you. They are the board's governance structure. They often include the what, why, and the what, again, apparently, happens if something does or does not occur. All right? It's built, most of them are built on state and federal statute. As our chair of the committee once said in a public meeting, that our policy is often our codification of our values, of your values, and they are organized by topic in our policy manual. Those are the colorful buttons that run down the left of the page. R&P stands for Regulation and Procedures. These belong to staff, and these are the how policy gets implemented. Policy can appear in more than one place, so you may find a policy that has 3 numbers to it. Policy 1510 is how we refer to it, but it also is 1510, 4200, and 7270. That means that it will appear in 3 places in the policy manual because it really does live in the governing principles of the board, policies regarding students, and policies regarding personnel. The R&P are numbered the same as the policy. They include R&P right beside it, and they're included right underneath the policy in our policy manual. So how do we get to the board vote when we present to you at a board meeting and you vote on action, and then we put on the consent agenda for the second reading? It starts with the green flag. If you're a NASCAR fan, you know the green flag, or an IndyCar fan, green means go. With observed need, either by the board or from staff or from our relationship with the North Carolina School Boards Association, who has a manual called Policies to Lead the Schools. So they develop model policies for school systems across the state of North Carolina. We take those, and then those are given to staff to work on a draft of a policy. Staff works in-house and with our attorneys. We then take it to the school superintendent's leadership team, which includes all the area assistant principals and chief officers along with our superintendent. You'll see that arrow goes both ways. If it does not make it through SLT, it goes back to staff for more work. Back to SLT. If it makes it through SLT, it shows up here at Policy Committee, where we also work with our attorney before it comes to you to make sure that everything is in order. You may send it back to staff. We don't like it. It needs some more work. Please change this. We'd like these updates made. At which point it begins the process again. If you approve the policy, you will recommend it to go on an action agenda at the end of this meeting. And we will put it there, and then it will go to a board vote. Sometimes at a board meeting, you may find something else, or you've had further thoughts, and you may send it back to staff again, at which point we start the cycle again, or we bring it back to policy committee, or you tell us to bring it back on second reading. The end point of all of this is that we end up with adopted policy. Last week, at the meeting on the 17th, you took action to approve 3 policies. Those will be posted on our manual any time now. They've been sent for posting. I want to talk just a little bit more about how we start, the starting process. So from the School Board Association, they have a staff of attorneys who create model policies. So their Policies to Lead the Schools manual includes all of the policies that are required by the General Assembly and the North Carolina State Board of Education. So some policies we must have by law or by direction of the state board. All of their policies cover those requirements. If the board observes a need, you may say to your policy committee chair or to your board chair, hey, we think we need something on this. And then your committee chair and your board chair will speak with the superintendent, who will speak with staff, who will look to see if there's anything in the School Board Association's manual or anywhere across the state or the nation. We'll work with our attorneys, and we'll get it started in that process. Staff may observe a need. We use the same process. So a staff member will communicate with our district leadership. We will determine if there's an interest or a true need, a desire for a policy. We will work with our attorneys to find out whether or not that's feasible, and then we will start that process from there. Are there any questions about this or the slide before? Mr. Hershey.
When we post policies online, do we footnote them if they're required by state law or by the State Board of Education?
We do not footnote them in that manner. We do footnote legal references at the bottom, which may show, for example, one of the most common ones is duties and powers of the board. So you'll see that one a lot. So if there are any statutory references or State Board of Education policy references, those will be linked at the bottom.
Okay, but the general public wouldn't know necessarily if there's a policy that's required by it.
That's correct. The general public would not know if this one is required by the state or not.
Thank you.
So I was thinking, remember we have a policy that came up for review recently on bus idling. And the
Yes.
only reason we had that is that it's required by law.
Yes.
That all LEAs have that policy, right?
Yes.
So we'll talk about it in the meeting, we'll explain why, and there might be a little footnote that tells you to go to the statute, and if you go that far, you find it was required. But that's really the only way I guess you would find out,
I
right?
think so too.
Yeah. Thank you.
So prior to the policy reaching a board vote, staff has worked to review and revise. We've involved the appropriate staff in-house, subject matter experts, if you will, attorneys. We've determined whether or not there was needed, and we've gotten stakeholder feedback. We're a large district. We have over 200 principals, 10,000 teachers, so we often use stakeholder groups like the Division of Principals and Assistant Principals or subgroups of elementary, middle school, or high school principals, the Superintendent Teacher Advisory Council, which includes a teacher from every school in the district, the Superintendent Student Leadership Council, and our PTA Council, as well as other community groups. So if you ask us if we've gotten feedback, we should be able to tell you what group we've gotten it from. And it may not be that we've reached out to all 10,000 teachers, but we reached out to a smaller subset of those to get a representative idea of what the feedback is. The superintendent leadership team reviews the policy. Our attorneys have reviewed the policy. The policy committee reviews a policy and has an opportunity to question staff and our attorney. All of this happens before it reaches you for the first read when we present it to you at a board meeting. So today, at a policy committee meeting, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get that one to close or not.
Marlo.
Yep, got it. When we give you a new policy, new or revised policy, you're going to see black font. If this is a policy that we're taking through migration, this will be School Board Association model policy language. Red font will be where they have pulled our current policy over into their model policy, and the blue font will be any changes we've made since we got it from them. This is what you're going to see today. 2 policies that we've gotten from the School Board Association that we're migrating over, dealing with purchasing. You will see black font, that is their model policy, red in both policies where they've pulled over language from our current policy, and blue where our staff has made recommendations in that.
And they will remind us, I promise, at the meetings.
Yeah, yes, and we'll remind you. Okay, let's see.
Did I go the wrong way?
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's okay. There we go. If we bring you a revised policy, we're not bringing you one of those today. You will see current policy language in black. Any red font will be a recommendation or a revision that came from the School Board Association. And again, blue will always be revisions or recommendations by staff. Next slide. So now we're going to move to our policy migration project. This began in 2015, and it was an effort to align our current policy manual with the North Carolina School Board Association's policy manual, Policies to Lead the Schools. You'll see this reference as PLS. Our current manual, we call it our old manual, actually, is numbered 1,000 through 8,000. The new manual is numbered 1,000 through 9,000. This is our landing page. I didn't show you this earlier. I'm showing it to you now because the question always arises, well, how do people know where to go, new or old? So we're very explicit on our landing page that we are going through a policy migration project, or policy migration, and what the intent of that is. Many of our policies have been migrated, are in the new policy manual. Some of them have not yet been, and they're in the old policy manual. All of our finance policies, for example, and much of our finance staff is here with us today, are still in the old policy manual. They haven't been migrated yet. Some bits and pieces have already been replaced and may be in the new, and there's explicit language here that if there's any language that conflicts, we follow what's in the new policy manual. We try really hard not to have that be the case, but if so, that's what we attempt to do. This is what the old policy manual landing page looks like, or you can see it at the top, old policy manual, 1000s through 8000s there. Next slide. This is our new policy manual. You'll see it's 1000 through 9000. Next slide. I must have missed the slide. If you'll go back one. There we go. I want to point out to you the bottom button over on the left, the purple one, says revision history. In either manual, if you click on the revision history, you can see policies that have been added or removed, or archived, I think is what they call it, or revised, whether they're new or they've just been replaced, so that we want to be very transparent about what we're doing in our policy manual. Okay, so you can always see our actions there. Next slide. So our work is really about migrating our old policies over to the new policy manual. We continue to review and revise policy based on the district's changing need. There's changing federal and state statutes. The North Carolina State Board of Education revises and changes its policies. And twice a year, we're issued updates from the North Carolina School Board Association, who hosts our policy manual. And they will update policies in their model policy manual and then help us know what updates have been made. Some of those are based on state statute, federal statute. Some of them are recommended, some of them are required. And so we're always, you'll see revised, new, how are we weaving that in? How do we make sure we get revised what needs to be revised based on a timeline, or kind of goes to the back of the line to get our other policies through. So we also have technical corrections. Technical corrections are just very simple corrections. It could be the name of a change of a name of a position or a title or a mistake or a number. We don't put those on the action agenda. We don't bring them to the policy committee. We take them on the consent agenda because they're not of any substance, really. They don't change the substance of the policy. And sometimes we're developing new policies. These are WCPSS specific. And one example of that is last spring, we adopted a policy on professional learning communities. I'm listing a word there, 1610, 7800. We didn't have a policy on professional learning communities, and we require them in the district. We have them listed in our grading policies, our homework policies and plans, etc., but we didn't have a policy on them. The School Board Association does not have a policy on it. No district in North Carolina has a policy on professional learning communities, and I really couldn't find any nationally that had a policy about professional learning communities. We presented the need, and we were able to work through that process to get a policy passed. So that is one that you won't see anywhere else that is a Wake-only policy. So where are we now in migrating our policies over? We've migrated about 165 policies, not counting policies in multiple series. So we've moved through the 1000s up into the 6000s. Next slide, please. And in the 6,000s, you'll see we've got them broken down into 6,100s. Those were student health services, school nutrition services, et cetera. We're currently in the purchasing function. We should finish up the last two of those today. And then we'll begin in the 6,500s, which are equipment, materials, and supplies. What remains after that, personnel, fiscal management, and facilities. Of that, there are about 88 policies. 11 more in the 6,500s, 45 in personnel. That's a large chunk there. 19 in fiscal management, 13 in facilities. So what remains? Last year, we did 30 revised policies, 16 new policies, and 9 RMP. We've been working on the migration project for a long time, and we still have a considerable lump to make it through. But we do usually bring you 4 to 6 revisions or migrations per meeting, and we can increase that number, hopefully not reduce that number. But so, what questions do you have? What can we help clarify?
Thank you, Dr. Crane and Dr. Robinson, for this. And Dr. Crane did not say this, but she is an amazing wordsmith. She knows that I use a lot of small words, and she somehow makes it an elegant sentence and policy. So she's an amazing wordsmith. That becomes important because while most of these policies, if you heard, are required by somebody, but as she noted, I always say that the policies are the heart of who we are. It describes our ethics. It describes who we believe we are as a district. So I think it's important that we put our spin on it. Some move faster, some move slower. Hence, you see we still have a chunk of work to go. But I encourage you to ask questions. Definitely use the policy page. I can speak to Ms. Waters is really good at this. We were on a conference call, and all of a sudden people were asking questions, and she was just popping those policies in there, and I was like, you really use that website really well. But it is the place that you go, especially for new board members when you're meeting with constituents. Most of their questions are going to go back to a policy because it's the heart of who we are as a district. So hopefully that's been helpful to you, and this is your space to ask questions, feedback. I wanted RMP mentioned there because it is the how, and it's the place that we rarely see as board members, but I thought new board members needed to know that there is an internal how document for the district. Mr. Hershey.
What's the time frame for finishing the entire process?
Depends on how many we can knock out.
Yeah, so I'll jump in on this one. We actually talked about this a little bit this week as we were reviewing this. So you heard Julie talk about the pace last year was around not quite 50 policies, right? And we may not have had a policy committee meeting every single month, but 50 to 60 policies, you have 88 left, so probably 2 years worth of work. But it really depends on what those policies are and how much the changes are and how much conversation happens at the board table around it, which is also why it's important, as Julie noted through part of her presentation, that each policy goes through a number of steps before it ever gets to you. So you've got staff who have reviewed it, content or subject areas who have reviewed it, staff in the policy world that have reviewed it, our attorneys have reviewed it, the leadership team has reviewed it, stakeholder groups have given input. So there's a lot of work that happens before it comes to the board. And so I say that because I think when the board provides feedback around what's in a policy, some of the questions are really sometimes about learning. So why do we have to say this? Or I don't know if I like this language, and we can say things like, that's the language in the federal statute. So that's why you see it that way there. Or the feedback was about X, Y, and Z. This is why you see it this way. And sometimes your filter, the lens that you're looking at it, I think is really helpful if it's, so how does a parent who reads this see it? And how does it accomplish what we're trying to accomplish as a board? So I think those are some things that you might want to think about. What are the questions that you want to ask yourself as you're reviewing policy that comes to you for the purpose of revision or adoption? But the short answer is we might could get it done in a couple of years if we continue the pace that we're on now.
And that's also recognizing that there are policies that we will revisit that are important to us, that are not in the
ongoing
sequence.
review.
So the bell schedule, you've all received multiple emails this year, this week about it. That's a policy that staff has done a significant amount of work on. We sent them back to do more work. And so those are things that are out of sequence of the policy migration that will still pop up. So I think that also is probably the only other factor I would add into the superintendent's factor of time is how many policies we want to see in the policy committee as well.
And a lot of times, Julie mentioned, or Crane mentioned that twice a year you get updates from the School Boards Association. Some of those are time sensitive. You know, the General Assembly need to put a policy in place by X date. we had, and we, for example, we changed the policy 1710, 1720 around harassment, discrimination, bullying when the Title IX regulations changed. And that was, all of a sudden the Fed said, you got to get this done this summer. It was like a huge overhaul. So lots of those things come into play where you kind of have to stop and focus because you get a legislative deadline.
Other questions, comments? Ms. Ward?
I just want to make a comment. Thank you, Ms. Johnson-Hoster, Dr. Crane, Dr. Robinson, for doing this kind of very introductory one-on-one. I certainly filled in some pieces for me as well, so I appreciate you all starting at this point. Great information.
I was very aware it could feel like ABC blocks, and I didn't want to insult you, but wanted you to have some information. Like I don't think I put a slide in there on the functionality of the manual online. You can actually download as PDF or download in a Word document. That would make it easier for your constituents to view or for you to share documents with folks. So. Again, hope is helpful, and if there's anything we can do to help you find something, let us know. We'll do our best to point you in that direction.
And they know them by heart, as you can tell. Mr. Haggard.
So one thing that I didn't see in the presentation just about the process that I know sometimes we get some questions about is when the policy comes up, we have different readings. First reading, second reading, third reading. Sometimes it comes to like the full board on second reading. Sometimes we'll see things on consent. What's the difference between all of the readings and how do they end up where they do?
Sure. So today, at the end of a meeting, when we finish discussing a policy, one of you will make a motion to put it on the action agenda at an upcoming board meeting. All of the first reads of policy are on the action agenda. You will receive a presentation in front of the board from the appropriate leadership member, and then you will take an actual vote on that, and it will pass, hopefully, pass first reading. Second reading of a policy that has passed first reading usually goes on the consent agenda. At that point, when you reach the consent agenda in a meeting, you will approve the consent agenda, and at that point, that is considered a passed policy by the board, and we'll move it on to publish it. Occasionally, as you did last week, the board will say, we'd like to bring this back to second reading and do that publicly just to raise awareness and bring attention to it. So we presented it to you again last week on the action agenda. So that was the reason for that. Sometimes between the first and the second agenda, the board requests changes. If a change is made and is substantial enough that you recommend it, we will bring it back to the second reading or an action reading also to make sure the public is aware of that second reading, the changes that were made and that were discussed publicly. Sure.
And how do we get to third readings? How does,
It's not really a third reading per se.
Yeah, I think what happens is it just doesn't, the board sends it back to committee.
It comes back a third time.
I see.
But I used wrong.
That's all right.
If the board, if it makes it to a first reading and it doesn't pass, for example, the board may say at that meeting, there have been some further developments since we talked about this in policy committee. We would like to take it back to policy committee for more discussion. At that point, the readings reset. So when it goes again, it would be another first reading of the policy.
And interesting, you have policy that explains how you do policy. So you have like
Explains how we do it.
policy
2420
2420 sort of does lay all this out, action and so on and so forth, technical changes, as Dr. Crane was talking about. I was going to just add a little bit to that. There's also language in that about if for whatever reason there was a time where you needed to suspend a policy, that requires 2/3 vote. I think that had come up once before as well. And you also have a policy on R&Ps. And that's policy 2470. And one thing about R&Ps, while it is the sort of turf of staff to implement your policies. It's a bit like federal law, and then the federal government, the administration creates regulations, right, to implement them. It's this sort of the same thing, but staff is under that policy is expected to required to notify the board about any R&P that comes into play or is revised, so the board gets to see it. And if at some point, if the board felt that an R&P didn't align with policy, that rarely happens, but it could be the case, that board members can ask that come up and address it. So or say, hey, can you change that? We don't think that really aligns with policy, because an R&P cannot conflict with policy, right? Policy governs, R&P implements.
So just to be clear, if there was something, if the policy is on the second reading, it's on the consent agenda, for some reason or one way or another, somebody decide, well, we want to put it onto the action agenda. What is the process again?
Perfect. That was going to be the last thing that I would add here. So as you all know, the chair and the vice chair meet with leadership prior to our board meetings, and so we currently govern ourselves that the policy chair and the chair and vice chair, I would alert the chair and vice chair, this is Dr. Ng wants to move policy 1700 to action. He has a comment, which I actually did that myself as incoming chair to the bullying and harassment. I asked the chair and vice chair to consider moving that policy to action and taking it out of consent, because I wanted to, as someone mentioned earlier, I wanted to bring back the awareness that this policy is going to be ongoing a review for us. So it's a request, and it's always going to be a request to the chair and the vice chair. And then they will, of course, we will know in assembly what the decision was. But it does go to leadership to decide, and that leadership is the chair, vice chair, the superintendent, and whoever from her leadership team is engaged with that particular policy. But great question. I would say almost always the answer is going to be the chair and vice chair and the superintendent will generally make the final decisions about what shows up on the action agenda. But every board member can ask. And then Joth can speak to the policy of how we move something if we'd like to.
Yeah, I'll speak to that just right now. So again, you have a policy that addresses this very thing. It's policy 2330, and it's called board member agenda. And that covers all that. And it actually does say that any board member may move items from the consent to the action agenda prior to board approval of the agenda. So that while individual members don't have the authority to, create an action item on their own, and there's a whole procedure for that. But when it comes to moving an item, the policy does allow any member to say, hey, I want to make sure that that's moved, because consent is action, right? Consent, the board is approving it. So, it's just that action is an individualized look at it at that meeting. And so any member can say, hey, this is on consent. I just want us to look at this a little closer. And as long as you provide notice beforehand under policy 2330, then that would be moved.
And the notice beforehand is truly a courtesy.
Yes.
To let them know beforehand that you're going to. One, you could, to Jonathan's point, you could actually make that motion in the board meeting. The courtesy is saying to the chair, hey, I really want this moved to action.
I'm just going to chime in here a little bit and say that when you have something that's on consent and you want to move it to action, it's important to sort of understand where you're coming from in the desire to do so. And there's lots of places that you can be coming from as an individual board member. You want it on action because you want a further opportunity for a public vetting on it. There may be a question or concern that you have. You may want the opportunity to vote on it as individual board members as opposed to it being part of a slate. Staff asks when you're going to move something that if at all possible, we be aware of it by noon on Monday prior to a board meeting on Tuesday, because we don't automatically have staff that have the detailed knowledge that might be necessary at every board meeting, which is after work hours when something is moved to action. So we want to make sure that we have staff prepared to answer any questions or engage in any discussion or dialogue with the board. Occasionally, there may be a question that you have that can be resolved prior and doesn't necessitate it moving to action, but that's totally within your realm and your call. It's just because we would prefer to have the staff there to be able to speak to the questions versus potentially taking the item off the agenda because the staff is not available to answer the questions.
Any other questions?
Can I just add one other thing? We've had I know it seems like a small point, but we've had a lot of discussions through the years in these policy committees about cross-references. So I wanted to talk about it for a second. So school boards associations, at the end of their policy, they list so many darn, cross-references. They jump. It's like 25 for every one of them, and those change. When there's a new policy that comes out, those change and change and change, so that then you have to bring it back and change your policy so what you all have done is not put the cross-references in, but when there's an important cross-reference that the board says, this is something that we think the public needs to be able to know about, then it's put in the body of the policy itself, and it gives you a link to it, a hot link. So then it's like, okay, this is important, then we're going to put it in there, and you can jump to it. So that was one of the things that I wanted. And then to the really good questions about what is the purpose of this policy, like do we say, for example, that this is required by law? I think that is something that comes up in policy committee, every time. What is the purpose? Is this an important philosophy, that the board has, like your equity policy? Is this something that this is board-driven, important? Is this required by law? Is this a situation where it's a critical reminder to staff? Like the body of law out there is so broad that you can't put it all in policy. But some things you want to put in policy to make sure that staff reading it, knows that. For example, when do I have to report to law enforcement or to Child Protective Services? Those are things that you got to get right. So we put those important reminders in policy as well. So knowing the purpose, I think, really does help a lot in your policy meetings to sort of drive, okay, this one we have to have. This one is this something that's necessary, and so on and so forth. And what staff has done and the board has done is, when in doubt, if there's language from the School Boards Association that people are fine with, they're just not 100% sure whether we should or shouldn't go with it, the general push has been to adopt the School Boards Association's language. Now, not if you disagree with it, or not if you think you can do something that's more custom to WAEG, but if there's no real objection to it, it makes it easier over time to update the manual, because the School Boards Association is updating their manual, and they're the ones that are closest to new legislation, and so that's why they'll update it and say, here's a change. So that's just some of the history, I think, that we've gone through with the migration. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Any other questions? And again, hopefully this was useful for everyone, and it's definitely a template that you can go back and as a little cheat sheet if you have to remember things. But staff does a great job of reminding us. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Robinson, Dr. Crane.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so next we have the great privilege of your first time of moving a policy out of this committee to the board, hopefully. So thank you, Mark Winters and Deborah Wallace, and they will be helping us review board policy 64.
All right, thank you.
And you have those examples below, as Dr. Crane mentioned, new and current.
That's right. I was just going to say, when you open these, you're going to see two policies that are attached in assembly. One will say current, the other one will say new. So you will see that the two policies that you're looking at today replace parts of current policies and are part of a set of 5 policies that we started back in November in replacing some purchasing policies. We did not move the other 3 forward until we got these 2 through as well, so that we were not replacing bits and pieces only of current policy, but would replace it in full. So what you will see at your next board meeting, should you recommend these 2 today go on to action, is you will actually see 5 at your next board meeting. The other 3 were recommended for action in November by the policy committee then. And then we waited until we had the rest of that series together to move forward at one time.
And thank you, Dr. Crane. Before we start, I'd like to note that our chair is watching via WebEx. This is our first time back in here, so our process used to be that we could review them and we could actually see each other and actively engage, but I do want to note that the chair's joined us online.
All right. So thank you, Dr. Crane. After that great introduction, I hope we can live up to the build-up on this one. The good news is we have all three colors of print. So that's a good example of what we're doing. So we have a couple of policies today. The first one is 6420. It says contracts with the board. It's actually purchasing contracts with the board, and it's more related to equipment, supplies, and materials, not so much services. The second contract will deal with services. And with me today is Deborah Wallace, our Senior Director of Purchasing, and she's going to go through these policies and talk to you about the material inside. Okay, Deborah, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. As Mark stated, we have three different colors, and unfortunately, I cannot read Ghost Rider Blue. So I've struggled with that, so if you see me pause, that is why. I did, however, borrow my secretary's reading glasses so I can get through that. But as we start, I wanted to... We'll start with policy 6420, which basically, as Mark stated, deals with materials, equipment, and supplies. The second policy is going to deal with services. There's not as many things to discuss on the services piece as there will be on this one. And I'll make references back and forth to the fact about the removal of the word services. The very first paragraph on this policy, you'll see the word services is removed. And that's because they are treated completely different than materials, supplies, and equipment. That is the section, beginning with Section A, the authorization to enter into contracts. This is basically mirrors our current policy, and theoretically it just states if the money's not there, the purchase order's not going through. It does refer back to the pre-audit and disbursement recommendations and sign-offs. And the key also there is language that we have seen more and more over the course of the last 4 to 5 years is that contracts or purchase orders can't be entered into with a restricted company if they're listed on the state treasurer's list for those. That is something that has changed. We work very hard with Jonathan's team to make sure that we stay current with that because it can change, the language can change. That is something that is new to the policy being implemented. As we move to the second paragraph, the first portion of that is stricken basically because it alludes to services, and again, services are not being addressed in this policy. As we move on where you see the parenthetical statement, we would like to actually take that statement and move it to the bottom of this paragraph and remove the parentheses so that it does note that we're not talking about construction work, but it's not the beginning of that sentence. We want to eliminate as much confusion on that piece as well because this policy does not deal with anything related to construction.
So, Ms. Wallace, you want to move the approval to the bottom, more like a footnote?
Well, to the bottom of the paragraph.
Oh, just the bottom of the paragraph. Got it.
Move the parentheses.
Thank you.
That's a sentence, right?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. As we move through that, unless there's a prohibited statute or regulation, the superintendent or designee can enter into these contracts of any amount to provide materials, equipment, and supplies, as long as the purchase is within the remaining funds in the allocated budget for the current fiscal year. Again, alluding back to the fact that the money has to be there. The superintendent may seek board approval for certain expenditures. So some things may come to the board as well. As you look past that, this is the part I struggle with the Ghost Rider Blue. All of the bottom portion of that is being recommended to be removed because, again, it talks about change orders and making amendments. And technically, with a purchase order for goods, materials, or equipment, you should not be amending those. They're typically quoted and bid out. So the information that comes back in and people set and record their purchase orders or issue their requisitions for those, that's a set amount. And instead of being able to go back, if a vendor comes to them and says, okay, well, no, we got the wrong price on there, we need to increase this by $300 or whatever, it's already been determined, it's been quoted, so the end users should not be processing amendments to change those amounts. That's when the purchasing department or the buyers get involved and make sure that it wasn't a snafu on the quote, we entered it wrong or something like that. But if that was a quoted price, then we don't allow the end users to increase their purchase orders or amend those. Different than a service contract, and we'll talk about that when we get to that. The second to the last paragraph on this first page. To provide greater flexibility at the school level, the superintendent may also establish circumstances in which the principals may enter into contracts for materials, equipment, and supplies. It was recommended that we strike through the involving amounts up to, because that can vary depending on legislation or anything else. Our thresholds are set for what's allowable for small dollar, competed prices, what quote levels, that type of thing. So instead of coming back and forth several times to amend that based on what the market may look like or what legislation may be in effect, recommended to strike through that piece. The superintendent, with appropriate involvement with the finance officer, shall establish the procedures necessary to ensure accountability and reporting by principals who enter into contracts. So that gives the superintendent and the finance officer opportunities to review some of those things that may come forward, but also that it doesn't restrict the superintendent from making those decisions if she decides that principal XYZ probably doesn't need quite that amount of flexibility or whatever. She could rescind that and basically set those as well.
Currently, our number is that up to $10,000. At $10,000 and above, they have to have additional approval.
Thank you.
And the very last paragraph is, at least monthly, the superintendent shall report to the board all contracts, again, purchase orders, approved by the superintendent under this policy that exceed $250,000 for the purchase of materials, equipment, and supplies. That is typically done on a consent item on the board agenda. As we move to the second page, contract forms and contract forms are reviewed with board attorney based on different language, different types of changes, new legislation, wording, basically protections for the district as well. And it's typically through consultation with the board attorneys that we develop our RFPs or our IFBs, amend terms and conditions, and any contract-specific language that needs to be amended to make sure that we're legally presenting the terms and conditions that we're required to, and also for any changes that may occur. The next piece, Mark, I'll let you speak to the GASB information as far as lease purchases, but basically examples of the leases that we may see are for copiers, that type of thing, and they're you know the numbers better than I do.
So we put in the amount of $2,500 or above, which is our purchase order limit. If you purchase anything at $2,500 or above, you're required to have a purchase order. Items below $2,500, we let the budget manager have responsibility. So we really don't need to look at many lease purchase contracts that are at less than $2,500 because that's not substantial and really wouldn't make much difference. I will say it speaks to reporting to the board. This past year when I presented the annual financial report, there was a section in that report, which is a new GASB, Governmental Accounting Standards Board requirement, which I know this is terrible to have to listen to, but it's a requirement that we must meet, that we report on every single lease that we have within the system. What is the principal and what is the interest and what is the future amount due on that lease? So that was a new requirement in this year's financials, and so you were reported at that time. We have well over 1,000 leases in the school system, and that sounds like a lot, but when you think about each individual copier at every school is an individual lease. So it's not per school, but it's every individual copier at that school is an individual lease. So we will report on all those. We have all the information, and we will provide that report on our annual financial report. And if you need additional information, we're willing to provide it at any time.
As we move to Section D, this is an area I could speak hours on, to be honest with you, because there are so many. You can
Please
do this.
don't.
I will not today, I promise. Basically, Section D talks about the other applicable policies and laws that are required by the school district. Department of Administration's Division of Purchasing Contract, we are allowed to use the division for state contracts and that type of thing. So, that is an option for the district. However, one of the key points to that is if we do use those contracts, we must follow them by the letter. And for some of the things that we do, our flexibility is a little different there. So if we're going to go out and use a contract and it has an abnormal quantity in it with the state, we have to abide by that abnormal quantity. So we can't necessarily use that as a district agency-specific contract because it would limit the amount that we could do. We would have to get permission from DOA, and then we would have to follow suit from there. That comes into play typically more so in technology than it does in goods and materials from P&C. They've kind of eliminated their abnormal quantities, which helps us when we're building new schools with furniture. But again, all the contracts involving construction, repair work, and purchase of apparatus, supplies, materials, and equipment must fall under the compliance with Chapter 143 of the general statutes, unless it's somewhere else in the law that says there are differences. And then contracts, of course, must be applicable to all board policy. And again, originally we listed those policies, however, those have been stricken so that, again, we don't have this huge list. And Jonathan, I won't use your disclaimers on how to describe that, but
Thank you.
and we reiterate in this policy the E-Verify requirement. That's on all of our terms and conditions.
Are we open for questions? Jonathan, Julie?
Got a question. So let's say there was a purchase that was $2,000, and then for reasons like inflation, the price of it goes up. Then does it have to go through these purchase contracts?
Once it breaks the $2,500 threshold,
Even though you've already had purchases before that for the very same item. Got it. Just a question.
Good or bad? Yes, that's the answer.
That's almost one of our favorite things to do, is to challenge those types of things. It breaks up the monotony sometimes of buying widgets or whatever. And we've seen a lot of that. I will tell you, in the last 2 years, we have seen a lot of that. And market availability. That's the excuse. Because of COVID, we can't get blah, 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 and we have to raise our prices. Well, if we go out and we see that that's not the case, then we will challenge that.
Rest assured, we do know that you are not just e-verifying, but you all are verifying. We learned when we were buying PPE from Mr. Winter how much we were verifying actual cover costs. Mr. Hersey, then Mr. Haggard.
What's the purpose of the line, the superintendent may seek board approval for certain expenditures? Can I just say, would she not have that ability without that line?
She would. She would. And it's just so stated in the migration of the policies.
As the designee report, because the sentence before it talks about a designee, so are they reporting to the superintendent to potentially bring something before the board, or are those two separate kind of issues?
No, I think that if, for instance, say Mr. Winters felt like something was critical and that, or just for information, and he needed to take that to the superintendent and say, well, we're looking at this, what do you think? And then, of course, she would look at it and say, yes, I think this would be an opportunity to take this as information to the board. Not necessarily, we don't see that very often, but there may be some odd thing that comes through the district that more eyes would want to just be informed, so that if you're out and your constituents come up to you, you would be informed of that so that you are not blindsided or know absolutely nothing about it and then have to reverse the process and come back through everyone again for that information.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I will say many times in policies, you'll see the superintendent may have to do something, or the superintendent or designee. In a school system this size, the superintendent is not going to want to review every purchase order. So as a finance officer or purchasing officer or whatever it may be, that designee is able to do that and report back as needed.
Good point. And you'll see the designee in multiple of our policies based on what topic area it is and what leadership person it is.
If I could just
Yes.
add as well, I think one of the principles that staff operates under, whether it's written anywhere or not, is no surprises,
That's right.
period.
That's right.
We don't like to surprise each other. We certainly don't like to surprise you. And so if we're going to err, we're going to err on the side of more information and more disclosure than not. With policy, with finance numbers, and you may not want to hear hours of the things that Deborah Wells can speak on, but you know that she can.
Right.
And if you needed her, she would give you the information, that information.
The only other thing about that sentence is that there may be situations where there's not the money in the particular budget item, and this would say the superintendent can come and say, we'd like to move some money into this area, and then be able to proceed with this expenditure because we think it's a very important expenditure. So because right now, staff is limited to be able to expend it as long as it's within the budget for that item. So.
I think at the last board, the last board meeting, I think I said something about this, and I'll say it again because it is important. Our financial system is built so you cannot overspend a budget line item. It will not allow you. It will stop you until money is moved, which is a good thing. It's a very good thing.
So I'd like to get a little more information about the why behind the policy. And, a lot of our policies work together, and so you have to view them in a bigger context, not just what's on the page in front of you. So we have the policy that we've just talked about, and then we have the next policy on the agenda too. It seems like what this policy does is, overall, there's like two big functions. One is to split services from the contract and leave this just with equipment, supplies, and things like that. And then the next one is that we have a policy for services that we'll look at. And then, so you've broken those two out, but then it seems like what this one does is it removes a lot of, this might not be the best way to phrase it, but like a lot of the approval or oversight because before you look at language about board approval is required for anything over a certain amount, and that seems to go away for the supplies and equipment items, but we keep that, it looks like, on services with different thresholds, services over 100,000. And so I'm just wondering why more than it's what the School Board Association recommended.
So I'm going to take the first shot, then I'll let you take the next. Supplies and materials have many requirements around the bidding process. So there are state legal requirements that you must bid and go through these steps. So there's not a real need for the Board of Education to then come in and say, okay, I agree that you bid this and this is the best item. Services are not required to be bid. So the Board of Education reviews those services. Now, we bid just about every service we do, but we do not have to. We've made that choice in order to create competition and get a better price and better service for the school system. But without the requirement to be bid, that's one of the reasons why you see items over $100,000 for contracts for services. Now I'll turn it to you for the next part.
Okay, that was going to be what I was going to say.
Thank goodness.
And I think probably the reason that we see it like this, because these policies are going to overlap. You're going to see similar language in other policies that are here. And by separating it, it gives the information about services, because that is key. When I came here, I was from the environments where you bid everything regardless of whatever. So when I first saw that language, I thought, yeah. But then I was like, with the leadership that I had, I was like, no, we're gonna bid. We're gonna compete these services. And that, to me, keeps it honest, and it keeps it fair. Because like Mark was saying, this is a fourth of the binders that I have. I mean, you've seen me come to policy before, and I have notebooks galore of everything we do, and it changes daily. But, it's really important that everyone understands that in order for the district to be successful is that fair and open competition has to be there. And it very easily could not be there in services if the district didn't support the competition and bringing it to the board and our general public so that they understand this is not, we just don't go out and go, oh, you're the game of the week, we're going to go with you this week and you're going to get this contract.
So then if I understand you, what we have here is for equipment and supplies and those kinds of purchases, there's already a lot of other strict accountability measures, whereas we wouldn't need that, whereas they don't exist for services. So we need to maintain that for services, but we don't want to have duplicate requirements or duplicate steps for equipment and supplies. Is that?
Yeah, I do not think the board would want to see every time we purchase supplies over $100,000 because we have a warehouse, we buy computers, we do things that we make mass purchases.
But you're saying that's tightly regulated.
That's regulated already, yeah.
Okay.
We're required by limits, at different limits, to take different steps in the bid process, informal, formal bids.
Okay.
And we take all those processes.
And one of the things that you noted is
Appreciate that.
it statutorily could change. So by putting it in statute, we'd have to change our policy each time the statute says this is the threshold for bidding. So we'd be constantly updating our policy. But I do think it's important to lift up both of those items, Mr. Haggerty, that one, we're already regulated, but the other piece that we've talked a lot about when we created the equity policy is that, again, back to our moral code, is bidding everything is both fair and equitable practices so that we are asking our staff to create RFPs and opportunities for small businesses, minority-owned businesses, so that we're not just going with the best game in town, which as a large district in a metropolitan area would be easier to do, but this district has, far before our equity policy, always found it important to bid out. And so thank you for lifting up that is our practice, and you will see that in the next policy, as Mr. Haggerty noted.
Yeah, because most of the small businesses and the minority businesses are services.
Right.
There's very few where you purchase the goods. There's some, but not as many. So I feel like they would lose the opportunity if we did not go through those steps.
That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Madam
Mr.
Chair.
Williams. Any other questions, comments? Thank you. And you stay with us, and Mr. Haggerty, I will not. So, but you both are staying with us, and we've already had the great lead-in to talk about 6450 purchase of services.
Yeah, this is services. I'll turn this over to Deborah also.
As we stated, technically, North Carolina law does not require services to be competed. However, the district takes a different take on that, and we do compete those. There are some limited requirements from both federally funded purchases for services and state board policies that requires, like such as driver's ed services, to be bid. So we do those as well. However, there are very few services that cannot be competed in the district, just to be completely honest. Whether that's if you need things on the health-related field, or you need counseling, or you need different services, the opportunity to bid that in this area is huge. So we're very fortunate that we live in the region that we do, so that we can bid those services. The very first paragraph is technically just an explanation of that, and again, going into the fact that services are not required by North Carolina law, but we do continue to do that. We want to make sure that services are purchased in a manner that's consistent with purchasing goals and what's been established as policy by the board. And the board generally does not require competitive bidding for the purchase of services. However, again, as it's written, that is the policy, understanding that it is highly encouraged that services are competed. Moving down to the third paragraph, any service contract amendment or service contract or any change order to construction or repair contract made on behalf of the school board of education involving expenditures of $100,000 or more must receive prior approval by the board. This is across the board for everything, whether it's a service related to academics, services related to maintenance, service related to construction. Those contracts must come before the board. And as you read through that section, these are just the dollar thresholds and requirements that are proposed for this policy, so that it reiterates, again, the $100,000 mark, those should come to the board.
So just a note, as Dr. Crane mentioned, the red is coming over from current policy. So this is all information out of our current policy. And in the second $100,000, so individuals are allowed to enter into contracts without bringing to the Board of Education below $100,000, and change orders that are below $100,000. So if you approve a $100,000 contract and there's a need for $50,000 additional on that contract, it does not come back to the board other than a reporting function for approval until you go over that $100,000 limit for the change order.
Did you have any additional?
No, I was just going to call attention to the last sentence where it says required by law the superintendent shall seek bids. That goes back again to the federally funded purchases or state board policy or any legislation that may be passed down that says you should compete this type of service. Again, same thing as on the other policy. You cannot enter into any kind of contract with any company that is on the state treasurer's list, and that's in accordance with the general statutes. Purchasing with use of federal funds have to be made in accordance with that, with the terms and conditions, and technically that is pretty much written in regardless of the federal fund. It could be whether it's an ESSER or if it's a grant through a different organization, Child Nutrition Services or anything like that. Anything where federal money is used, those have to be competed. And we typically, when we see those, we don't look at the thresholds, we just bid them, only because it's a little wonky on different grants about dollar thresholds on those. Some say 10K, you don't have to follow the guidelines. Other things we get from school government says bid it, so we just bid them all, regardless of what they are. If they're federally funded, we don't look at a threshold on them. I'm sorry, and the last paragraph of this section goes back again and speaks to the fact that this policy does not reflect anything construction related or architecturally related. If you turn to the back page, the last statement, a contract should not be divided to evade requirements of this policy. The superintendent shall develop regulations and procedures to ensure compliance with this policy and state law. This is basically to avoid any situations, and this is true on the goods, materials, and equipment side as well. You cannot create contracts. If you create a contract for $75,000 this month and a vendor runs through this, you cannot create another $75,000 contract the next month to avoid bringing that contract to the board. Same thing with goods, materials, and equipment. You can't split purchase orders to circumvent the policies or the thresholds.
Now, it does allow if you have a $75,000 contract at this school, and 2 months later you find out you have a second school that has some needs, you could enter into a $75,000 contract, but that's not for the same item. Right. So it does allow for that.
Questions from the board members? Ms. Evans?
Yeah, thanks. I'm struggling with this one to figure out what the change is, because you said the red text is from the old version, correct, that's coming over to the new. So is it, I see this blue, just this down here. I just want to make sure I'm understanding that this really isn't much of a change.
It isn't. It just pretty much defines services versus goods, materials, and equipment.
Okay.
And as you look at future and existing policies that we're looking at. It goes into a lot of detail on both of these at one time. So this kind of gives you a policy that addresses goods, materials, and equipment, one that addresses services, and outlines.
Yeah. All right, thank you so much.
We upgraded the School Boards Association's policy by bringing over the other piece.
Mr. Hershey, did you have a
So can you say that again?
Well, I'm saying we upgraded the School Boards Association because the School Board Association is in black, and we took our piece of 8361, which is restrictions that we have currently, that was our old policy, and we put them in the School Boards Association policy. So we created more detail with limits than what the School Board Association shared originally.
That's helpful.
This is a good example of one that's migration. We're changing from the old number to the new number pattern, and we're making a few changes, but it's largely language that exists already.
But the red font was not suggested or required by,
Correct.
even though
Right, this
that's
is-
what that says.
So that says if we present a new or revised versus, so that's for a revised policy right there. This is a new one.
Could we not have like a standard that doesn't have two different? I mean, yes.
Well, how many colors do you want?
Well, I mean, if it's,
I can provide a.
I mean, I don't really care.
Yeah, no,
but that was a confusion immediately.
I understand.
And that really was an issue of colors.
Yeah.
Because we've had green in the past also, I think, at some point. And I mean, it was just, so.
We try to do our best to.
Yeah, I got you.
But it can be confusing because we talk about new and old,
Yeah.
right? The 8361 is what we had, so that's old policy. But the document that you have in black, right, is the new policy coming from the school board, but we're taking new language, which is red, but we're describing it as old language because we were already doing it. So when you say is it new, is it old, it can really throw you. It can really
So
throw
it's
you.
really not new, it's just transferred to this document.
It's taking language we had, but putting it into a new, and it's coming from the 8361 bucket and going into this 6450 bucket. Yeah.
Because what's going to happen with 8361 is they've split, in their manual, they split 8361 into construction stuff, services, and non-construction. So this is about non-construction stuff. This will go into a different, the rest of what's in here will go into a different policy regarding construction services.
Are there any more questions about 6450 or 6450 as it relates to 6420? Okay. Well, at this point, I think the staff has asked for committee approval for the two different policies. We'll run them one at a time. So at this point, what's the committee's decision on approval for policy 6420? Is there a motion?
Just as a reminder, it's a motion to move it to the full board for action, if the board members so inclined.
For clarity, it's only people appointed to this facility or to this committee that vote and make
Everyone, by practice, generally, everyone who's in attendance as a board member casts a vote.
Okay.
Is it a vote or more like a thumbs up?
So the way it's been is if you don't have a majority of the committee there, then the chair will deputize the rest of the members, and then everybody that's there is sort of on the committee for that day. But if you have a majority of the committee there, then technically those are the ones that motion and vote. But I would agree with Vice Chair Haggerty that a lot of times everybody sort of puts their hand up and supports it.
The Tracy asks recommendations for action, next steps. Committee approval is requested. So we're looking for an indication of approval. Do we have a general motion? Does anyone dissent? Is there any objections? Okay, so we will move policy 6420 to our full board meeting for action. All right, the next policy, 6450, similar question. Is there approval from the committee to move it forward? Any objections or reservations? All right, well then it looks like we will move committee, or policy 6450 from the committee to action. All right. At this point, there's nothing listed as new business. As we look at the agenda, trying to see if we have next meeting set. Next meeting, February 28th, 2023. Unless there's any other business, we'll call the meeting closed.
Thanks, Chris.
All right.
So, Mr. Hagan, the chair's not here. I was going to ask her to do this, but the hearing that we're not able to do right now on Thursday, just wondering if there's board members that might be available in the morning on Thursday.